At the time of the revolution, dogs had barked all day and night over Russia, but now they had fallen silent. Labor had set in and the laborers slept in quiet. Militiamen outside kept guard over the silence of the workers' dwellings, so that their sleep would be deep and nourishing for the morning's labor. This passage evokes two essential themes of the novel. Firstly, the image of silence and sleep shows the lack of life of the workers. The workers sleep to work and work until they sleep. The workers, during the period which Platonov is writing, lost an essential part of what it means to be human and are reduced to being cogs in a machine. The machine being the 5-year plan. Platonov explores the transition from individual purpose towards collective purpose. Secondly, the image of the dogs, which originally barked all day and night during the period of the revolution, have now gone quiet. This image invokes the second important aspect of the novel, an exploration of what eternity is. What does it mean to achieve the communist goal? Platonov shows that eternity, or heaven, is in fact a terrifying concept. It isn't a victory, but in fact, the end of what it means to be human. The Foundation Pit doesn't really have main characters, as the narrative follows different characters throughout the novel. But it begins with Voshchev, a factory worker who is let go from his job because he keeps thinking on the job. He, throughout the novel, is thinking about the meaning of life. After he is fired, Voshchev is now homeless and roams around the countryside until he unknowingly sleeps on a soon-to-be construction site. He is awakened by a mower and is recruited as a digger for the Foundation Pit. It is the Foundation Pit of an all-proletariat workers' building. The novel now follows the workers digging the Foundation Pit as they dig through the summer and autumn. Many of the workers are depressed, for lack of a better term. One of the workers, for instance, Prushevsky, plans his own death and finally gets relief because his life has an endpoint. Another character is a disabled veteran, Zhachev, of the capitalist war, i.e. the Russian Civil War. The veteran constantly torments the laborers. For example, there is an instance where the veteran hits one of the workers and an argument breaks out. And in the background there is Voshchev, still confused about life, wishing he was a mosquito, because then at least his fate would be certain. As the work in the Foundation Pit drags on, two workers, Prushevsky and Chiklin, reminisce about a woman in their youth. They go find the woman and find a toothless old, dying woman who is half decomposed. Feeding the woman is her daughter, Nastya. The woman rolls over and dies, and the workers adopt Nastya, who becomes a symbol of hope for the workers. As the novel progresses, the Foundation Pit is constantly expanded as they try and surpass their quota. The work is grueling, but Nastya, as a symbol of the future generations, gives the workers hope. The second half of the novel begins in winter. Voshchev and Chiklin and Nastya travel to the nearby village. This half of the novel describes the village being collectivized. As the collectivization process goes on, we see the spirit of the peasants disintegrate. Many of them are crying about the loss of their farms, and many die. Eventually, the village activist or leader gets the order to liquidate the kulaks as a class. The characters are seen traveling through the farms owned by soon-to-be liquidated kulaks and see countless corpses of cattle slaughtered in order to avoid collectivization. The kulaks are eventually sent downriver on a raft, never to be seen again. The remaining peasants celebrate until they collapse on the ground. Voshchev eventually takes over the leadership role in the village, and Chiklin and Nastya return to the Foundation Pit. Nastya falls ill. She keeps falling asleep and crying for her mother as she wakes up, and she eventually dies. The remaining workers bury her and continue digging the Foundation Pit. Not much is known about Platonov's life. but he apparently would throw away a lot of what he wrote. His wife would often collect fragments of writing from trash cans. The most important aspect of Platonov for our purposes is that he lived in the Soviet Union and was, for the most part, a believer in the communist dream. He worked as a railway and electrical engineer and contributed to the war effort during the Civil War. He was also an aspiring writer in the Soviet Union. The Foundation Pit was actually first written on the back of a rejected manuscript in 1930. The period which Platonov is writing in concerns the dawn of Stalinism, specifically the transition from the new economic policy towards the massive collectivization of the 5-year plans, specifically the transition from Leninism to Stalinism. The New Economic Policy, or NEP, was a period of relative economic liberalism in the Soviet Union. Started in order to recover from the devastating Civil War. Soviet leadership considered the Soviet Union to be too agrarian and destroyed to be ready for socialism. Therefore, they allowed for some economic liberties to usher in the capitalist industrial age. Platonov writes during what is called the Great Break, the reversal of the NEP in the large-scale collectivization ushered in by Stalin with his first 5-year plan. A sense of urgency underpinned the entire 5-year plan. We see this urgency reflected in the Foundation Pit. The characters are constantly stressed and urged to increase the size of the pit and work harder. In many ways, the first 5-year plan was more revolutionary than 1917. If anything, the average Soviet citizen in this era shared an even greater sense of participating in an unprecedented historical epoch and hastening the arrival of a utopian future than had been the case in the disorder which ushered in the October Revolution of 1917. This period felt like a drastic shift to the average Soviet citizen. The nature of work changed, and social and economic relations were drastically altered. The whole country was pushed into a state of fury to increase industrial and agricultural output. Historians speak of the general atmosphere of running out of time, as administrators scrambled to meet the stringent quotas. Millions of peasants now found themselves on state-run farms, and many laborers were promoted into administrative roles. An atmosphere of stress emerged, and many learned to cope with extreme pressure from above, a trademark of the Stalinist era. The state now became the sole provider of labor and determined your present and future. In terms of industrial output, the 5-year plan was a massive success. In the Foundation Pit, Platonov examines this great break. In the first half of the novel, Platonov examines the labor-oriented perspective. And the second half, he describes the brutal effects of agricultural collectivization. The agricultural collectivization was much more disastrous than the industrial one. This is a passage from the Foundation Pit, describing the slaughtered cattle by the kulaks in protest of collectivization. Cows and horses were lying in these yards, their carcasses gaping and rotting, and the heat of life accumulated during long years beneath the sun was still seeping out from them into the air. When the bear touched one sheep with his foot, flies flew up from it. They had fixed themselves up with a fattening method of life inside the hot, beefy gorges of a sheep body. The rapid agricultural collectivization and the protest against it, by burning farmland and slaughtering cattle, resulted in large-scale famines throughout the Soviet Union. The kulakification resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, most murdered simply because of their class status. In the Foundation Pit, we see the attitude taken towards kulaks. While many kulaks did resist Soviet policies, an attitude of extreme distrust emerged between the two parties. We see in one instance in the novel how the village leader even believes the chickens to have kulak tendencies because they didn't lay enough eggs. Now let's get into the themes of the novel. Starting off with the first one, the death of the individual notions about life and a transition into a shared collective experience of reality. Let's imagine individual temporal realms. Legacy, how you shape the world and how this shaping lives after you. Nostalgia, a longing for a past which no longer exists. Hopes and dreams, these are all profoundly personal and individual. Platonov, through his examination of the 5-year plan and the rapid collectivization, is examining the transition from individual notions of time and experience towards collective goals and aspirations. As an example, let's take one of the largest and most ancient collective construction projects still around today, the pyramids in Egypt. Here is an extract from a poem by Percy Shelley, which illustrates Platonov's thoughts. The pyramid which guilt first planned, which man has built, at whose footstone want and woe with a ceaseless murmur flow. Do the workers of the pyramids experience time? A building project which lasted decades, in which many died before seeing its completion. How is it possible to translate your own individual notions of time and allow yourself, your ambitions and aspirations, to transition into the collective goal of completing the construction project, i.e. the pyramid? Platonov is also examining this question. Is it even possible for humanity to put aside their own selves and work together? Platonov's answer is complex, and we could argue that he leans towards no. Let's now examine one of the main themes of the novel, sleep. Sleep is a condition which you do when you are calm, rested, and satisfied. But Platonov reverses this idea. Sleep becomes a means to an end, the end being meeting the construction quota. The workers work until they sleep, and sleep to work. For example, during a period of intense workload, the diggers become so exhausted that they collapse and sleep almost instantly. Soon the entire work team, submitting to common exhaustion, fell asleep as it lived, in daytime shirts and trousers, so as not to labor over the undoing of buttons and to preserve its powers for production. Sleep is no longer a personal moment, but a collective process which is done solely to be productive in the morning. Here is another quote. Evening was already setting in. Blue night was rising in the distance, promising sleep and cool breathing, and above the earth, like sorrow, stood the dead height. Platonov elsewhere in the novel describes the evening as a personal moment. If we think about it for our own lives, the evening is a time when you can do as you please. This intimate moment is being robbed away from the workers by the extent of the workload. Sleep therefore becomes a prison. It becomes a necessity and robs the evening from the workers. Sleep is also often intertwined with death in the novel. Various dreams come to the laboring man at night. Some express a fulfilled hope, while others foresense a personal coffin in a clay grave. But daytime is lived by everyone according to the same stooped method, through the endurance of a body digging into the earth in order to plant into a fresh abyss. We see that while some workers dream of hope, others dream of a coffin. This reflects Platonov's own complex relationship with the 5-year plan and Stalin. While maybe the brutal workload and collectivization will bring a bright future, the journey towards this future feels like entering a coffin. The term abyss here, representing the unending foundation pit, also hints at another theme of Platonov's, which I will explore later, the terrifying concept of eternity. This image of sleep brings us to the central problem Platonov is describing. Through the arduous workload, the workers are losing themselves and what it means to be human, in an individual, personal sense. Voshchev is initially fired for constantly thinking about life on the job. The labor board questions him, and he specifies what exactly he is thinking about. I was thinking about a plan of shared general life. I'm not afraid of my own life. My own life's no riddle to me. We see here that it's not individual life which Vushchev is questioning. It is the nature of shared communal life. As the workers find Nastya, the workers seem to find some hope and meaning. Here is the quote. All the other diggers observed the sleep of this small being, who one day would have dominion over their graves and live on a pacified earth that had been packed with their bones. Nastya gives the workers some meaning. The brutality of their labor will eventually kill them, and they find some relief in the fact that their collective bones will pack the earth for Nastya and future generations to walk on. Here's another passage. Vushchev felt his body with his hands and decided, it was best to stop thinking. Let what went on living be something shared and general. Vushchev finally submits to losing his individuality. This is not something he gives up willingly but submits to, due to the grueling workload. Platonov is not arguing against a shared communal concept of humanity, but is criticizing the speed and excesses of Stalinism. A real historical analogy to Platonov's foundation pit could be the Palace of the Soviets. The Palace of the Soviets was a massive building project on top of a demolished cathedral in Moscow. Its purpose was to house large-scale conventions and meetings of Soviet leadership. If it was built, it would have been the tallest structure on Earth, with a height of 416 meters. During construction, many problems arose. For instance, it was questionable whether the statue of Lenin on top of the monument would even be visible from below. Eventually, a foundation pit of 110 meters deep was dug, and this would be all that would remain of the monument, as it was paused due to the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It would eventually become a swimming pool in the 1950s. In a way, Platonov predicts the future. The Palace of the Soviets, a massive construction project, perhaps is a real-life reflection of what Platonov is criticizing Stalin for. The collectivization and brutality of the workload is more than people can handle. Platonov is objecting that fundamental aspects of what it means to be human need to be addressed before communist utopia is achieved. Platonov is also asking whether it is even possible for humanity to unite in such a way. We can relate this question to the biblical passage on the Tower of Babel. Here is the Bible passage. Come, let us build ourselves a city, with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Platonov is re-asking this biblical-aged question. Can humanity unite and build something greater? While the Bible does signal that uniting is an act of hubris, Platonov is not necessarily against the idea and was a committed communist. Platonov is asking whether it is possible, especially with the countless abuses done by Stalin. Platonov shows his love of the future generations through the workers' love of Nastya. While Nastya dies, her name may give another meaning. Nastya is a name derived from the Greek word anastasis. Perhaps Nastya will be resurrected in the future. On Nastya's death, the workers also bury her in a way that she is perfectly preserved. Platonov even wrote an additional line in one of the early versions of the foundation pit. The corpses in the foundation pit are the seed of the future in the orifice of the earth. Platonov therefore believes that the brutality and harsh conditions do have a purpose. Platonov was deeply torn by the excesses of Stalin and whether they will lead to a greater humanity. Let's now move on to the second and last theme of the novel. Let's take a look at the Christian grand timeline of humanity. We start with Adam and Eve, then when she eats the fruit of knowledge, and humanity is banished from heaven. Then we have Jesus and his crucifixion. And later in the future, according to Christianity, Jesus will return and lead us to building a new Jerusalem, and the world as we know it will end. In communist theory, we have first the invention of private property, then feudalism, then the onset of capitalism, and finally the beginning of socialism, which will eventually lead to a communist utopia. In both these grand temporal conceptions of humanity, the end times, Armageddon, when utopia is achieved, is actually rarely explored or elaborated on. Platonov is exploring this concept in the Foundation Pit. What does it actually mean to achieve utopia? After the kulaks are sent downriver and disappear forever, there is a large-scale celebration and dancing in the village. Collectivization has been achieved. Peasants dance until they fall over and sleep. As they are resting, one of the diggers, Chiklin, reflects on what is occurring. Chiklin gazed for a long time into the exultant thick of the people and felt, in his own breast, the peace of goodness. From the height of the porch, he could see the lunar purity of the distant scale of things, the sadness of light that had gone still, and the submissive sleep of the entire world. A world that had cost so much labor and pain to organize that this had been forgotten by everyone, so that they would not know the terror of living on further. Even though the goal of collectivization has been achieved, the imagery of stillness and sleep is terrifying. So much had been done to achieve utopia, but living on further is scary. Platonov is hinting that achieving utopia is a terrifying prospect. Even though the world is still impure, there is something wrong. Another passage illustrates this. This comes right after the kulaks are sent downriver. The snowy wind fell silent. An unclear moon came to light in a distant sky that was now emptied of storm clouds and blizzards. A sky so deserted that it allowed for eternal freedom, and so sinister that freedom was unthinkable without friendship. The kulaks are gone, likened to the absence of storm clouds and blizzards. Purity has been achieved. However, what we get is a desert, an absence of humanity. The prospect of eternal freedom is terrifying. Imagine for a second eternal freedom. Imagine an endless restaurant menu. You would spend an eternity making your decision. Freedom, in fact, can be a form of prison. Platonov is describing utopia. The last line, freedom was unthinkable without friendship. How I understand this is that friendship breaks the underlying rules associated with heaven and utopia. Friendship is a special relationship between two people. It breaks the idea of communal love and equality. I am friends with someone in contrast to me being strangers with someone else. This is incompatible with heaven. Platonov is hinting at the idea that achieving utopia is, for one thing, perhaps impossible, but also it fundamentally breaks what it means to be human. In essence, the journey to the goal is the real driving force of humanity, and if this journey towards utopia is so crushing, like under Stalin's regime, what really is the point? One of the workers, Prushevsky, upon seeing the woman he longs for, remarks, "It's not the one I saw in my youth. Or maybe it is, after close sensations. I've not always recognized people I love, though in the distance I've yearned for them." What makes life worth living is the journey. Once you see what you are longing for, it is not something you recognize, actually. In our capitalist society, success is measured by money. But does money bring fulfillment and happiness? Most literary accounts would say no. For instance, let's examine an extract from the fable The Cobbler and the Financier from Jean de La Fontaine. The cobbler starts off very happy in his relative poverty compared to the financier. However, the financier gives him a large sum of silver, and the cobbler's happiness soon dissipates. The cobbler thought the silver more than he had ever dreamed before. The mines for ages could produce, or world with all its people use. He took it home and there did hide, and with it laid his joy aside. No more of song, no more of sleep, but cares, suspicions in their stead, and false alarms by fancy fed. His eyes and ears their vigils keep, and not a cat can tread the floor. So after receiving his money, the cobbler quickly becomes suspicious and paranoid. This idea is also laid out in song by the notorious B.I.G. in More Money, More Problems. I will end with a quote by Joseph Brodsky, a famous essayist and poet who wrote in the preface to The Foundation Pit. The idea of paradise is the logical end of human thought in the respect that it, though goes no further, for beyond paradise there is nothing else happens, and therefore one can say that paradise is a dead end. It is the last vision of space, the end of things, the summit of the mountain, the peak from which there is nowhere to step, except into Chronos, in connection with which the concept of eternal life arises. The same may be said of hell.